Yo, have you heard of LinkedIn Learning? If you haven't, LinkedIn Learning is an American massive open online course provider. It provides video courses taught by industry experts in a variety of subjects. Now, why am I sharing this? I'm sharing this because Living Corporate is in partnership with LinkedIn Learning to provide diversity, equity, and inclusion courses. Listen, if you're trying to be a better ally, you want to understand better diversity, equity, inclusion strategies, or you just want to learn how to be a better leader, you got to check out the courses on LinkedIn Learning. So check it out. You can do it one of two ways. You can click the link in the show notes, or you go to LinkedIn Learning and you search Living Corporate. Again, link in the show notes, or go to LinkedIn Learning and search Living Corporate. I'll see you over there. Dr. Session, how you doing?
I'm good, Zachary. How are you?
I'm doing really well. You know, I've been really looking forward to like having you on Living Corporate for a while. Let's start with your background, the fact that you are a PhD, right? Like, what does that add to your profile, or how do you believe that empowers you in the work that you do, from a leadership development, from a diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging perspective? Like, how does that add dimensionality to your work?
Well, I can tell you it definitely changed the dynamic of the relations I have with my executives. I think that when they feel that they're sitting across the table from someone who, A, has a level of experience that I do. I've been in HR for over 30 years. I've been the head of HR where I sat at the table with executives for 10 of those years. And then you add in the work I've done in the diversity space since 2007. And then you layer that with the fact that I have, doctor in front of my name, right? So I think that not only adds a different layer of validity to the work that I'm doing, but also it makes people really want to pay attention to what I'm telling them. And I think that is what makes the work that much easier, is because I don't encounter as much resistance.
You know, as I was kind of looking into your profile, like, and just looking at the content that you've published and the things that you speak about, you talk about psychological safety. I think
Mhm.
I'd like to sit there for a second and really like hear you wax poetic a bit on just like what is psychological safety
Mhm.
and its relevance to Black and brown folks in the workplace.
Yeah, it's a term that people really are just starting to get familiar with, I would say, over the last couple of years since the untimely murder of George Floyd, when Black people and brown people really started talking about what their experiences felt like in the workplace, especially when they're the only one or one of few. And what we revealed through those conversations was that we didn't feel safe in the workplace. We didn't feel safe being our true, authentic selves. We had to change or alter parts of who we are, whether it was our personalities, the way we dress, the way we wore our hair, um, the way we expressed ourselves and our facial expressions, because they were all being misinterpreted. And then we experienced microaggressions and high levels of bias and discrimination as a result of that. We couldn't take the same risks that our white counterparts could take. We couldn't voice our opinions around the table the way our white counterparts could, without either them being disregarded or ridiculed, or in some ways us being retaliated against because of it. So when you put all that on the table and you unpack all that, that means the workplace was not safe. It wasn't safe for us psychologically. Physically, yes, we could show up and there would be no physical harm brought to us in most cases, but we did not feel that mental well-being part of it. And that's the part that I think a lot of companies are hopefully paying attention to now, to create a place of inclusion and belonging for all of their employees. I don't want to leave anyone out of the conversation, but for all of their employees. Women experience it too, right? So one of the biggest microaggressions about women is being talked over in meetings and their opinions not being taken seriously and them not being respected as leaders. So it's across the board in terms of psychological safety.
You know, it's interesting to your point. What you're describing, it reminds me of some years ago. And while I was in consulting, I remember I was the only Black man, the only Black person, and the only man. I'm actually on my
Wow.
immediate team, and with everyone else was white women. And I recall being consistently microaggressed or macroaggressed in terms
Hmm.
of my intelligence being questioned,
Hmm.
folks questioning if like, well, you're using these words, I don't feel like that's really you, like it feels like you're putting on a show, like how do you really talk?
Hmm.
And I was like, well,
Right. You're so articulate.
What are you saying? I'll never forget one time I used the word ruminate. I said, I need to ruminate
Mhm.
on that. And they were like, and they said, I feel like you don't know what that word. I said, and I looked up, we Googled it together, and
Wow.
I said, ruminate means to think about something. It's the second definition. The first the origin is of
Woof.
a cow eating grass and chewing it over and over. But the second definition, and the definition that's commonly used in social contexts, is to think about or ponder or to reflect for a period of time. So
Or think
I
about it over and over like the cow chewing the
like the
grass.
chew, like the cow chewing the grass. Like I don't understand, you know what I mean? So, but my point is,
Mhm.
I recall in that season, I recall just not feeling that was the issue. Is I didn't feel, and so what happened was it impacted my confidence, it impacted my performance, it impacted my own just whatever. And like some of that is also like, okay, how much of that do you have to make sure you have an inner sense of worth and like you don't let everything dictate
True.
every. And though not but, and I'd say it's challenging when like literally your entire environment is questioning your validity,
Right.
and your right to if you should even be in the seat that you sit,
Mhm.
right? And I think like I think there's a large element like how racism, misogyny, all the isms, how they show up for folks, for historically marginalized folks, is like through resentment. Like folks just resent your presence, right?
Yes.
They resent you even just like existing, and
Mhm.
or you can exist, but you better not exist in a space higher than me. Because the other context is I was the manager, right? So I was supposed to be the project manager of the team. I was supposed to be leading the team,
Wow.
right? But everyone was questioning and challenging me on every little thing. And then I'd be like, okay, what are you saying? Right. And I'd ask a couple follow-up questions, be like, okay, I did that already, or okay, no, I disagree, or whatever the case is. It's just so it's interesting. Like, so when you talk about psychological safety, what are some ways that you believe executive organizations or executive leadership teams can create more psychologically safe environments?
Well, I think the first thing they have to do is lead by example. So they have to be willing to have their own level of transparency, vulnerability. They have to give people who don't look like them space around tables or on projects or in conversations, even as sponsors, to open up doorways for them, open up opportunities. You know, those little things. I call them the little small hinges. They open big doors, right? So the culture has to be one where that's demonstrated on a regular basis, where you see people taking risks that look like you see people asking questions and challenging decisions without receiving any type of negative repercussions because of it. They're actually rewarded because of it, right? Because they have diversity of thought. And if that's not happening, then yes, there leads to question whether or not this is a place where I could be my true authentic self, where I can challenge the status quo. And I tell people just look around and see how people are expressing themselves physically. How are they dressing? Do you feel like that's who they are in terms of how they wear their hair? Do you see more women wearing their hair in natural, more black and brown women wearing their hair in a natural state, or do you not? Do you see, men, black and brown men, being able to wear their hair in its natural state and not feeling that they have to conform or assimilate or reduce who they are, pieces of who they are, in order to have that seat at the table?
It's interesting. Like as we look at like this DEI space, I'm curious to get your reactions to this. Like more and more, Dr. Session, I really feel like this work, like in a corporate capitalist context, is really like just a scam. Like it's like a way to like placate non-white or non-majority spaces, and also to gently or to more genteelly encourage like assimilation,
Hmm.
but not necessarily like, I don't believe, like I think there's like two distinct camps. I think there's like this one camp of DEI that's like, hey, we're here for like radical transformation and reimagination and dismantling of oppressive systems. Then there's this other camp that thinks that they're here for those things, but they're really like co-opting, like historically, like they're co-opting language to really like reaffirm the status quo. Like,
Hmm.
do you sense that in like the work that you do? Because I recognize like you work with a bunch of different brands. You're always speaking and educating and engaging in some space. Like, I'm curious, like, do you see that same tension? Do you feel like I'm oversimplifying it?
No, I definitely see that, and it's Unfortunate is what I'll say as someone who's been, as I said, in this space since 2007. So I've been doing this disruptive work since then in
Yes.
one way, shape, form, or another. And sometimes even before it was even called diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, some companies didn't even really know what it was I was doing. But I think that, especially over the last couple of years, Zachary, that some people got into this space because it was the in thing to do. It was quick and fast money, and they did more harm
Mm.
than good. And I'm waiting for them to just kind of fall by the wayside and move aside and let the professionals get in here and clean up their mess, because I've been called in to clean up the mess of people who have done this. Who, because they had a black or brown face, thought this is what I'm supposed to be doing. And oh, by the way, I don't want to ruffle too many feathers. I'm not going to say the word systemic racism or white supremacy or oppressive behaviors. Like, those things are going to be too disruptive. They're not ready to hear that. Well, if they're not ready to hear that conversation, they're not ready to do the work. Because you have to hold a mirror up to these CEOs, you have to hold a mirror up to these leaders, and to the company as a whole, even to HR. And HR, those are my peers, and I have to hold them accountable. So I think if you're of the mindset that you don't want to hurt someone's feelings, that you have to walk on eggshells to get this work done, not only will you be ineffective and the employees will see right through you because it's performative, but you're going to also very quickly burn yourself out because you're not going to make any see any results.
To your point around kind of like folks coming in there for various reasons, like not all of them being like altruistic or just honorable. I'm curious, like, have you heard of the term Jedi?
Jedi, yeah.
Like, do you think that organizational justice is possible within a capitalist context?
It depends on the organization. Honestly, I've seen some organizations that have justice as part of their work and their languaging around this. I've had people who have anti-racism as part of their languaging, accessibility, so it really depends on where they're trying to transform the culture and through what lens. So is it possible? Yes. But again, I think it has to be a very forward thinking organization from the leadership in particular. They have to, again, have been willing to sit down and sit in their mess and be willing to face it, and then be willing to do the work and walk the walk and talk the talk. So, yes, can justice be part of it? Absolutely. Depending on the organization, that could be the focus that they have. I have an RFP with an organization right now, and that's what they're focused on: is justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion.
So let me double click on that. Like when we talk about, and I'm asking because like I feel like we use words we use words without really like appreciating what they like the impact or implication of those words. Like
Hmm.
so justice to me it sounds like justice to me is like, let's say if it comes out that my supervisor was biased against me, gave me a poor performance review, which then impacted my ability to get a raise. Maybe I did not get a raise for a year, or I didn't get a raise, and I missed out on my annual raise. And like there's an
Hmm.
investigation that happens, and we find out, hey, in fact, you know what, this should not have happened. Justice in my mind then would demand, okay, one, the person who gave you this poor review, especially if we find out that it was because of some bias or they just wasn't following policy, they're held accountable. We can
Hmm.
export whatever. But also I get back pay for the money that I missed over a year.
I agree with you.
Do you see that? Have you seen that though? Have you seen like that kind of justice like operationalized or like played out in a company?
I have only once in my entire career as the head of HR for organizations. So not going in as a consultant doing this work for organizations, but when I was inside, sitting around and doing what they call roundtables and having these discussions with the managers, and then understanding later on that there were what I call three sides to the story. So they presented the case as X, the employee presented the case as Y. And by the time we did our full investigation, which took some time because we had to talk to other employees, we had to talk to clients as well, because this person was a client facing role. At the end of the day, we found out that this person wanted to withhold money from this individual who was a Black person so that they could give more money to someone else that they were trying to keep on the team that wasn't performing as high as the other. So ultimately, we did not only change the rating, we did give them the raise that they deserved. We did not negatively impact the person who did get the raise. just to let you know that we didn't do that. And that manager actually received their final warning, and within a few weeks, even they resigned and left the organization.
Yeah, I mean, that's like my dream. Like, I've the thing. That's well, so I've mentored like several people who have like talked and like what I just described, like that's happened to me in terms of like, yo, like I should have gotten a raise or like this, like what's
Mm,
happening here, whatever. But it's also happened to like several people that I've
of
mentored, right?
course,
Like, and so like that's a common experience for Black and Brown folks, for again for historically marginalized folks, and I
this
think like
happened to me.
see, look at that, come on now, Dr. Session. Now, so like so I think so, which kind of leads me to the next question I have is like, as we look around the nation, like we continue to see what do folks we call white lash. We're seeing white backlash to black progress or to any type of level of black consciousness around the oppression of black bodies, right? So like
Hmm.
so George Floyd was murdered and everybody was like, yo, we care about black people. We're gonna put Black Lives Matter on some bumper stickers, we're gonna put it on the floor, on the ground, we're gonna put some blimps up, let some streamers fly, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But and now we're seeing like the reaction to all of that, and we're seeing folks outlaw even saying the word racism or outlaw
Hmm.
saying white supremacy. We're seeing laws being erected in
Hmm.
Florida and Texas, and like we're seeing like the GOP run on platforms that are really just anti-black, and we're also seeing those folks win. We're seeing traction. We're seeing laws being passed in this regard. We're
Hmm.
seeing trans folks being attacked through
Hmm.
legislation. And
Voter
so
suppression. Hmm.
so my question is like, at what point does DEIB, like as a space, move past seeking to center white comfort and white acceptance? And like, is it possible for this work, again, like in corporate context, to exist without it centering or considering white fragilities?
That's a good question. I think yes. When I think about some of the people who are doing this work, they are having those tough conversations, sitting across the table and holding individuals who don't look like them accountable. I do it as well. I do it in a way that creates a safe space for them, because I feel that in my work and what has worked successfully is within that safe space is when they're able to have that level of vulnerability, that level of transparency, ask those scary, awkward questions that they've only asked people who look like them that don't really know the answers. So now they have an opportunity to ask someone who doesn't look like them, what is the impact? What does this feel like? Is this true in fact? Those types of things, right? Now, when we come to laws and whether it's local, state, or federal, it's risky and it's tricky because in that space we oftentimes are truly the minority. We may be the minority in the organization, but when you combine us together we may not be. But when you look at those individuals that are sitting at those spaces in local, federal, and state government, the voices aren't as loud sometimes, and I think that's risky. But I also know that we've been here before, right? So we've been here before. When you think about, for instance, Black Wall Street in Tulsa,
Mm,
Oklahoma,
mhm.
where we were thriving, not just surviving, and the people on the other side of the railroad tracks didn't like it, right? And so the first opportunity they had, they tore it down and made us run for our lives. And I think that's a little bit of what we're hearing and seeing today. Now, what I am appreciative of is the next generation. So I'm Gen X, I'm 53. I look at the younger Gen Y, I look at Gen Z in particular, and those groups are the ones that are really the zero tolerance group. And I think they're the real disruptors, they're the real ones that are going to make change happen. I had a client, Zachary, tell me, Dr. Session, I just don't think we're going to see change in our lifetime. He was a Gen X like myself. He said, I think it's going to take another 50 to 100 years because, our grandparents and some great grandparents have to die off, and that mindset has to, leave this earth in order for us to really see change. And I said, I hope not, because then what about the Gen Xers? Because they're going to be grandparents, many of them are already. And does that mean that, we just have to continually die off to see change? But I think the next generation, because they're so socially, ethnically, culturally diverse naturally, that their mindset is this is just the way it's supposed to be, and we don't understand why it's taking you all this long.
What excites me, so yes, and that's a beautiful segue because I want to talk about the future of work, right? I thought I was like radical and kind of like short fuse when it comes to like my expectations at work. I'm not as radical as I thought I was when I like look at my siblings who are all like just kind of getting into like they're in their late teens. They're about
Hmm.
my one of my little sisters both of my sisters are 20 and 20. They're in their 20s now.
Okay.
And then
Yep.
my little brothers are 17 and 18, right? And so how
Hmm.
they just think about and expect the world to work and how they expect the workplace to be in terms of
Hmm.
it's just it's so refreshingly bold and like
Yes.
and I'll say like I really don't believe I know for a fact actually let me not say I don't believe I know for a fact that workplaces are not prepared for those people where they're not really prepared for millennials are like the majority of the workforce today and they really not prepared for millennials and
Hmm.
we here right and some there's millennials who are like 40 now
Yep.
uh and so I know for a fact they're not ready for these 20 somethings coming up in there um I'm curious, like when you talk about generational diversity and like
Hmm.
the implication of like this workforce that is going to continue to come. In fact, the fact that like not only is this like Gen Z, it's a large workforce coming in, but it's also like the most diverse and like
Yep.
socially educated workforce ever like in the history of this country. I'm
Yep.
curious, like what are the implications that you see for companies like and just the future of work as a whole?
Yeah. So one of the things I do when I'm doing my work is I teach my executives and managers about the impact of the different generations on the workforce. And I pay a lot of attention to Gen Y and Gen Z. And I walk them through the mindset of these groups and ideally what they do expect from organizations. And if they're not already thinking about that, then they're already late to the game. They're behind the eight ball because, as you said, millennials have been here. That's when I got my start in diversity work was back in 2007 when they were graduating college. And, I was on campus recruiting this new generation of workforce. And I was like, whoa, they're asking different kinds of questions here. And what is pet insurance? Why do they care about pet insurance? That type of stuff. And I came back to my CEO and I said, this group is different. Like the way I was recruited and the way that we've been recruited is not going to work. We have to change our entire approach and even our benefits, right? So that's really where I got my start in understanding the diversity of the workforce. And then through there, now weaving that into all of the work that I do to help my leaders understand that if you're not paying attention to this group already, you've already failed as an organization. And guess what? Your company probably won't be around much longer because they're going to put businesses out, they're going to put companies out of business, period.
I think the other thing that like folks don't appreciate, it's not just that like Gen Z are like these like quote unquote hyper woke kids who just want like everything handed to them. Like that's a very lazy
Right.
and inaccurate analysis of like that group. They also just work faster. Like
Hmm.
like everything about them is just quicker. So like they're expecting not just like social change like faster because they see straight lines where we want to see a bunch of squiggles and detours. Like they also just see they from a process perspective and what they expect and how work should be done. Like hey, this goes here we
Yep.
do this to here. And so like I believe like my other I'm curious to see how the next 15 20 years play out is I think that like overly bureaucratic organizations or just like non-agile organizations like they're going to your point like they are not going to sustain
Yeah.
organizations with poor governance strategy who just can't make clear decisions they
Hmm.
don't understand like okay here's how we process things and move operationally like they're just not going to sustain because you're talking to a bunch of people who are used to just working in spaces and doing work on platforms where everything is damn near instantaneous so they're
Yeah.
not going to understand if they have an idea or they want to execute against something why we can't just execute against it right like
Hmm.
and, there's other challenges with that right as it pertains to like okay collaboration is still a thing negotiation is still a thing so like I'm not saying that and I've had this conversation with a bunch of different folks it's like I'm not saying that any generation if you were to like kind of make a persona out of any generation that it's right or it's wrong we're just talking about the reality of this persona right
Right.
like and so like you have to figure out okay how do you navigate against that something else is interesting is like I've seen where again, like because of the like because we're in this late stage capitalist society, like everyone has a side hustle these days. Like everybody is doing something, right? And like Gen Zs are the same. Like they have way bigger. A lot of them have way bigger online profiles than like their Gen X managers, than some of their millennial managers. And so like even like the implication of, okay, you're about to hire somebody for this 9 to 5 job, but this person who you're hiring has like 40,000 followers on Twitter. They have their own they have their own like brand. And
Yep.
so like you're when you're hiring a person, but you're also like hiring a company,
A
and
brand.
you're
Yep.
hiring a brand. And
Yeah.
so like even like employer contracts and like agreements in terms of, when you engage with this individual, you're not engaging with this individual who sits in a basement or sits in a
Hmm.
cubicle all day. You're engaging with this person who has direct access to like 40,000 people or
That's right.
50,000 people. And so, you working, it's not a relationship between you and this individual. It's just a relationship, again, to your point, which is, it's a relationship between you and a brand. And
Yep.
I don't, and even that, right? Like that part is, I think that's a lot for people to like really grasp and like consider the implications of, in terms of how you treat them. Because I see on more and more on LinkedIn, as LinkedIn continues to try to silence Black and brown voices, or any voice that like espouses like anything that's like anti-racist, or that's a little makes white folks too uncomfortable. I still see a lot of content out there that's like calling companies out, like people who have like, I've seen people who have like literally like 60, 70,000 followers on LinkedIn. Dr. Session will be like, yeah, I'm at this company, they put me on a performance improvement plan,
Yep.
it didn't make no sense.
Yep. Yep.
And I was like, yeah.
And I find it hilarious. I
I love
really
it.
do.
I love it every time. I love it every time, because I think that's like the biggest thing is like that I think that leads us to like a really good, leads us to a potential conversation around like power and like power
Hmm.
dynamics. I think like when we look at technology, like, and it's like, I believe that technology has like radically changed power scaling and power dynamics between people who have been historically silenced and marginalized. And I'm curious, like, where in your DEIB ethic and like in your praxis, like, do you consider power and its function in the space?
Throughout every single conversation that I have. I do a lot of training as well. So I do training on unconscious and implicit bias, microaggressions, what I call generational competencies, which is the multi-generational workforce. I do training on allyship, or some people starting to call it allyship. I do foundational understanding of DEI. Like, let's just boil down to the basics. Like, what is diversity? What is inclusion? What is, all of those facets of it? And I help people understand that power and privilege are not dirty words in this work, because every single one of us at some point in a relationship will have power and will have privilege. It's a matter of how we use it. Do we use it for good, or do we use it to benefit ourselves, or use it for evil? So helping people understand, first and foremost, getting past the wokeness of it all, of understanding that privilege is not bad, and I, as a Black woman, I will have privilege sometimes that my husband doesn't as a Black man, because purely because I'm a woman, or because I'm a Black woman. And maybe he's viewed differently as a Black man in the same situation. So I can now use my power, my privilege, to benefit him in that situation. So I think when I break it down like that, I help people understand and really look around how they yield their power, in a way that may negatively impact someone, although it could be unintentionally, but at least increasing that level of awareness, so they realize, like, oh, in this moment right now, I have this power and I can use it. How am I going to use it? How am I going to manifest it in a way that is going to make this situation better for this person? Because right now they're in a bad situation, whatever that situation may be in the workplace. So that's how I help people really think about power. Again, that is not a dirty word. Privilege is not a dirty word.
We're at the top of the decade. As I look at the political landscape, Dr. Session, I don't know, fam.
That makes two of us.
I don't know, dog. I think
Yeah, looking kind of shaky.
it's looking kind of shaky. And so to that end, right, as you look at like, potential like political changes, shifts in power,
Yeah.
white supremacist political parties, or
Mhm.
rather, white supremacy becoming more and more publicly, openly mainstream. Not to say that white supremacy ever has gone away or anything like that,
Mhm.
but that like these, like, we're seeing like rhetoric being like, we're seeing rhetoric, the volume knob on certain rhetoric like reaching higher decibel levels than even it was perhaps in like the 60s. We're seeing like
Oh yeah.
similar thoughts and ideas and principles like really being affirmed, that were affirmed about 50 years ago.
Hmm.
I'm curious, like, where do you see like the future of this work between like now and 2030?
That's a great question. Of course, everyone's paying attention to the midterms. Here we are in February, March rather, 2022. Midterms are coming up. So yeah, you're right. It's scary. It's shaky. It's a little shaky out there. Now, how will that play out in the workplace? I don't know. I think, we're starting to see a little bit of that now, as you mentioned, with the laws changing in Texas and Florida in particular, that are impacting, underrepresented groups, whether it's LGBTQ plus or whether it's, women and their health, being able to do what they want with their bodies, that they need to do with their bodies, or if it's with voter suppression. All those things will have a ripple effect into the workplace because at the end of the day, we show up and we're employees and we still have to deal with these things that happen around us socially. And that's where some of the justice part comes into the work as well, because organizations realize that they can have an influence in terms of who they put money behind or what their messaging is in the communities in which they serve and the clients or customers that they serve. They're diverse clients, they're diverse communities. So it's scary, just quite candidly and honestly. I think the conversations now are much louder and they're in much more public spaces because we have more access to social media than we ever had before. People are, like as you said, being very much more emboldened. I would say probably since when did Obama get into the office? 2008.
Mhm.
Dating back to then, I would say, from 2006 or seven when he started his campaign until he won, and then he won a second time. Like the voices got louder and louder and louder, right? Because their world was being disrupted. What they knew to be the norm no longer was, and that scared a lot of people. And now the voices, they've been even more empowered because of who was in office during the last administration and the whole campaign that he ran off of. So when you factor all of that in, these conversations were happening around us all the time. It's just that people felt, that they had to be politically correct or that they couldn't say certain things because they would, lose their job or get in trouble. And now we're seeing that that hasn't been the case. So they can do it and they can say it.
Dr. Session, this has been a fire conversation. I feel like we could continue on forever. I really want to give you space though, like just any final words or like shout outs before we let you go.
Final words, I would say first and foremost, thanks again for having me on. I really, really appreciate it. And, if anyone's interested in the work that I do or want to continue this conversation, they can always reach out to me on any social media platform at Dr. Tana M Session, as well as my website, tanamsession.com. Because, like yourself, I could talk about this stuff all day long.
I love it. Dr. Session, we consider you a friend of the show. Excited to have you back when you're ready to be back. And we'll talk to you soon.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Peace.
Living Corporate is a podcast by Living Corporate LLC. Our logo was designed by David Dawkins. Our theme music was produced by Ken Brown. Additional music production by Antoine Franklin for Musical Elevation. Post-production is handled by Jeremy Jackson. Got a topic suggestion? Email us at livingcorporatepodcast@gmail.com. You can find us online on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and living-corporate.com. Thanks for listening. Stay tuned.